Good morning and welcome. I am Fariborz Gadar, the William Schreier Chaired Professor of Global Policy and Planning at Penn State University Smeal College of Business. In this morning's webinar, we will look at the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on the oil and gas industry, and we will explore strategies to make the oil and gas supply chain more robust in the face of geopolitical volatility and market uncertainties, and ask, is it time to reassess public policy and the role of the oil and gas industry from the perspective of government, companies, and consumers? As the world gradually transitions to renewable energy, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has brought into sharp focus the world's deep and continuing dependency on hydrocarbons, much of it from unstable and vulnerable regions. This dependency limits government actions and company options to provide the energy our economies require. While European countries have reached a near total consensus on banning Russian oil imports and are exploring other alternatives, their dependence on natural gas continues to leave them vulnerable. This reliance raises the question on how to address the new geopolitical realities as we phase out of hydrocarbon dependence. We now see gasoline prices at $5 or over $5 in the US, diesel over $7, natural gas prices have nearly tripled, and they seem to be going on as we speak. To discuss these issues today, we have two distinguished and dear colleagues, Mr. Frank Verostra, Senior Advisor, Energy Security and Climate Change Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He previously led that group. And Mr. Hossein Ebn Youssef, International Oil and Gas Consultant with extensive international experience, who I often see in BBC and Voice of America. Welcome, gentlemen. Before we get started, I wanted to ask if you would share with us your background and experience in the oil and gas industry. Frank, why don't you start?
Thanks, Fariborz, and great to be here. So, like you're saying, extensive experience over 40 years for me. Service in government, industry, and in think tanks and academia. In the industry itself, I was Senior Vice President at Pennzoil. We did oil and gas projects all over the world. I started my career with Tosco in the downstream and then moved to the upstream. And Tosco was the largest refiner in the United States, but it was also the oil shale company. So I got an early start in the shale revolution. I'm a biochemist by training, with a master's from Harvard. My government experience included the Energy Department, Interior, and the White House in policy positions mostly. And at CSIS, I was brought on to head the Energy and National Security Program, which is now one of the top 10 think tank programs in energy in the world, which I'm very proud of. And recently retired from there and held the Schlesinger Chair, and now currently serve as a Senior Advisor for Energy Security and Climate Change. So thank you for that.
Good morning, and thank you. I'm delighted to participate in this important and timely conversation. I was born and raised in Iran. I came to this country to go to college, went to LSU, did my undergraduate work in petroleum engineering, and then to USC for graduate work. I started working for Atlantic Richfield, ARCO, with the international group in California and Los Angeles. And in '75, I went to Iran and headed the reservoir engineering group for a joint venture that ARCO was the administrator. And that was between 4 American companies and National Iranian Oil Company. After the revolution, I started working for the oil and gas, Orco Oil and Gas, the domestic side, and 6 years with the oil and gas, Orco Oil and Gas. And then I joined the corporate group and advised the management on the upstream companies. In '88, I started a consulting firm, and we focus on basically in the Middle East, North Africa, and then with the breakup of the former Soviet Union, we focus on Central Asia and the Caucasus. I retired 4 years ago, and basically I do a little consulting since then.
Before we look at current events, would you tell us what the state of the oil and gas industry was before Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
So, I mean, even go back before COVID, right? So pre-invasion and before the pandemic, oil companies were suffering a little bit from lack of finances, not enough equipment, not enough people, ESG and climate concerns. When the pandemic hit, and as you can imagine, since oil and gas are depletable resources, that hit a 4% decline rate. Every couple of years, you have to find a new Saudi Arabia, equivalent of Saudi Arabia, because we use 100 million barrels a day. In 2020, just like every other industry, from restaurants to businesses, the oil and gas industry saw demand crater. People weren't traveling, they weren't driving to work. Refineries couldn't sell their gasoline or aviation fuel. Companies laid off people. They canceled projects, held on to their cash. And as a result of that, when the pandemic got better, thank God, demand increased, and increased faster than we anticipated. So economic recovery came in, and then as a result of economic recovery, energy demand went up really quickly. And like everything else, whether it was supplies of other goods that were stranded around the world, it takes a while for the industry to gear up and produce what people need. And we are now back on the demand side to pre-pandemic levels. So a lot has happened over the 2 years. Hussein, if you want to talk about a little bit about Europe and Russia, that would be a great stage setter too.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Well, for decades, we've been trying to reduce dependency on fossil fuel. And with the limitations on the hydro and nuclear, the emphasis has been on wind and solar, basically. And although there's been quite a few advances in those areas, we are still quite a bit dependent on fossil fuel, close to 85%. Now, in addition to that, there were one other factor was the stability of prices that we enjoyed for so long. One of them was the fact, one of the reasons was that we had the spare production capacity. When the world was using 70, 80 million barrels of oil per day, that level, 4 to 5 million barrels of a spare capacity kept prices stable. But later on, with the creation of the strategic petroleum reserves, for instance, countries realized that it would be expensive to create and maintain the spare capacity. The other factor was storage, and private companies also realized that it's going to be expensive to maintain that level. So that has been reduced as well. And then the impact has been tremendous. Now, Russia, everyone is blaming Russia and also blaming Europe for the dependence on Russian oil. But as far as Russians are concerned, they are a European country. They have been very helpful in so many ways. particularly during the last century, during World War I and World War II. They participated with the mainstream European entities against the fascism. And geography, of course, helped them a great deal. They were just next door. But Europe is really a special case because of the Industrial Revolution. They became so much dependent on energy. Initially, they had coal. And then with the discovery of oil and then development of the auto industry, everyone started focusing on oil. And Russians were there. And then with the development of the seismic technology, they managed to find huge deposits of natural gas, particularly in Siberia. So they started depending on Russian gas as well. But the situation, of course, now is changing, and the frictions are high, and everyone is trying to find a way out.
So if I can, just in the context of continuing stage setting, if you go back to 2020, so during the pandemic, when people cut back runs, cut back production, OPEC was concerned about prices cratering too much. And there was a lot of spare capacity built up around the world in storage. So they took action, OPEC Plus, to reduce kind of quota supply by 9 million barrels a day to get rid of that excess inventory overhang so that prices could rise and encourage new investment. So that's what led us into 2022. So when we got to 2022, even at the beginning of this year, there were still concerns about COVID in Asia and what demand looked like. But as we got into the first quarter, demand started picking up everywhere. And that's when the shortages really started showing up. And so on the production side, it takes months you don't just turn the stuff on and off. And on the refining side, the early part of the year is when refineries go into maintenance or turnarounds. So it was a bad time to try to think that you could get everything up and running at the new level of demand that was anticipated. So that's where we were. And then the invasion occurred on February 24th.
By deciding not to buy Russian oil and putting sanctions on it, we would have to restructure the supply chain. Refining is geared to particular types of crude, and each market wants a particular blend. Different states have different specification requirements. This sounds like a very complicated logistical system adoption. How do we go about substituting for oil we don't get from Russia?
If we go back to the time of the invasion, at the time, as Hussein had said, Europe was 25% dependent on Russian oil, but 40% dependent on Russian gas. So a lot of pipelines moving in. Russia, depending on which month you're looking at, exported between 7.5 and 8 million barrels a day. And that was divided almost equally between Europe and Asia, and included about 2.5 million barrels a day of product and unfinished products that other refiners use to make additional fuels. Right? So when you talk about restructuring the market, there's waterborne carriage, which you put in tankers and you can move it around the world. But there's a difference between transit in the Atlantic basin and transit to Asia in terms of lead times and tankers. And then there's pipelines for both gas and oil. Restructuring takes a long time to move the logistics of resupplying, and it's very difficult at those volumes.
Hussein, are there any alternative sources of oil to serve the global economy in Europe in particular? So, for example, Saudi Arabia expanding its production, or Venezuela, or reducing some of the sanctions on Iran. What options are there?
Right. Well, that's not only in Europe. Everywhere else, it's the same thing. You design the refineries based on your needs, what type of products you need, and also you have to find the type of oil that would give you whether those kind of products that you need, whether you need gasoline or jet fuel, or you need diesel or what have you. So you may be able to ship that oil, say, to India. As Frank said, it's going to be very costly because the distance is 3.5 times more than the average distance between the European market to Russia. And then there's inefficiencies involved. So they can actually refine that oil, but the type of products that they give are going to be different. And then if they produce certain type of products that they don't need, they have to have a storage for it. And it's going to create more instability, and more costs will be associated with that. And then also pollution because of those factors. So for all those reasons, it's really not going to be advisable to, and if you can, to use different type of crude.
Frank, you want to expand on that, or?
Sure. I mean, so the point is totally accurate. Refineries can refine crude, but to optimize their base and make money, they want to take a specific kind of crude that matches their equipment and gives them a product slate that goes from, gasoline, kerosene, middle distillates, heating oil, specialty products, and petrochemicals that makes them money in sufficient quantities that they can sell to customers. And so this is the how fine-tuned the system is. So if gasoline demand goes up, just as an example in the United States, because people decided they're going to drive for vacations and not fly, you need more gasoline but less aviation fuel. Well, if your refinery is optimized to make, a certain percent of gasoline, certain percent of heating oil, certain percent of aviation fuel, what do you do with that? And in the United States, we actually export diesel to Europe because their cars run on diesel, and we import gasoline to the East Coast of the United States. So in addition to all this crude moving around, there's a lot of product moving around as well. And so this is where it gets cumbersome, and there's seasonal demand in addition to this, right? So more heating oil in the wintertime. In the summertime, you have a greater need for natural gas and renewables for electricity.
Well, I assume this is going to get even more complicated because the refinery outputs in one state are different than the other, and the specifications of the gasoline that you use in the summer is going to be different from the winter, and that has implications on the pollution levels in various cities. So that makes the whole refining and distribution of gasoline even more complicated.
We have summer grade and winter grade of gasoline. So, and by a certain date for smog and other reasons, you have to change over. So I think they will waive that just to remove any or try to facilitate more supply being out there. And the same thing with ethanol fuels, alcohol fuels, because they're trying to get more supply into the market. But if this is a high demand year, and it looks like so far, even at $5 a gallon, consumers are still driving. Now, there may be elasticity at $5.50 or $6, but we haven't seen it yet. And we're just at the beginning of the driving season here.
And there's some policy changes as well.
Yes.
For instance, in China, they decided that it would be best for them to cut back on refining operations. Because of the pollution, that's a serious pollution problem that they have. So for some time now, they've cut back quite a bit on their refining activities, and that creates a worldwide shortage as well.
It sounds like a very complicated logistical distribution system because you got different oils go into different refineries. And so where Russian oil would have gone may not accept other types of oil. So the complication of allocating different oils to different refineries will make replacing Russian oil in the global refinery network even more complicated. And that doesn't even address natural gas, where Europe is going to be desperately in need of natural gas coming from Russia.
So there's two policy questions here, right? It seems like for the United States right now, the primary focus, at least from polling numbers, is on inflation and high gasoline prices. That's what consumers are seeing. In Europe right now, your concern has to be more on the energy security side. Will you have enough gas for winter? Will you have enough diesel to plant crops and then harvest later on? And you have to start planning for seasons, as the Game of Thrones says, winter is coming, not that far off. So you have to plan ahead for this. Those two things they're not diametrically opposed, but they lead you to different solutions. So if you're looking just to reduce price in the United States, and the IEA encouraged the global partners to release oil from the strategic reserves around the world, that'll add about 1 million barrels a day. So if you start looking at what the losses are of Russian oil, those numbers vary widely. I would say I have the most accurate numbers, and accurate is a frame of reference right now because the Russian central bank is not providing trade data. So it's guessing. It's looking at tanker traffic, looking at where supply is going, looking at storage, and trying to extrapolate what those numbers are. But best guess so far is that there's been a reduction of between 500,000 barrels a day and 1.5 million. Initially, people said, right away, there's 2.5 million to 3 million that's coming off the market. That's not the case so far. Russia's selling oil to China and India, and earlier this spring to France and Germany. And the ones that they're selling outside of the G7, they're selling at a discount. And the discount is like $40 a barrel. So it's a risk reward. Do you think that you can get by and not get caught by sanctions because the attraction of getting oil so cheap, when the refined products, the margins are so good, it encourages some people to go out and buy that oil. There's also this notion that you can blend oil on the seas and maybe disguise the origin of it. So we're not exactly sure. You've seen the press reports recently about how Russia is making more money than they were pre-invasion. And that's because the price of oil has essentially doubled since the beginning of the year. And so even if their volume is down, they're still making more money. So the question is, what's your objective here? To reduce volume of Russian exports or the amount of money that they receive? And what's the best way to do that? And that's kind of where we are right now.
What happens if Russia cuts back either on oil or gas? What impact would that have on our operations?
Well, first of all, what has been said so far is actually true, but it's only one side of the coin. The other side is that how Russia is going to react to this whole thing. If they cut back on their export to Europe or export in total, then it's going to create a nightmare for everyone. So that's another factor, particularly in the case of natural gas, because Europe is awfully dependent. 40% dependency is a lot, and it's going to hit their industrial base. So it's going to be very difficult. Now, OPEC for decades didn't get any kind of assistance from Russia. They did not participate in any kind of decisions that OPEC was going to make. But with the development of the shale and the sharp increase in production in the U.S., Saudi Arabia decided to get closer to Russia, and Russia was more in line this time. So they started cooperating, and that's why, 6 years ago, we started seeing not only Russia, but also a number of other countries like Kazakhstan, for example, to participate in OPEC meeting and cooperate. So that has been the case, and they've been very helpful to each other during the COVID problem. But the major problem within OPEC is that number of cheap producers within OPEC have been under tremendous amount of pressure over the years, sanctions, US sanctions in particular. Venezuela is the largest country with the largest reserves of oil, has been under sanctions. Iran for almost 40 years now is under pressure. Iraq has a number of problems. Regime change, the Iran-Iraq war, the two Persian Gulf wars, long-time sanctions, UN sanctions, and so on. Libya, destruction of the country, and even now, huge fluctuation in the output. So there are a number of problems that OPEC have. They also, their spare capacity has diminished quite a bit. And right now, with the latest decision of Saudi Arabia, I honestly don't think they have a whole lot more excess capacity to contribute in the future.
Can I piggyback on that? So everything that Hussein said is absolutely correct. I would add Nigeria and Libya to that list, right? So they have capacity, but they're not able to do it. So 2 weeks ago, you saw that OPEC increased their monthly outlay. They've been unwinding their quota structure to put more oil on the market, but the countries aren't at quota. They can't produce the volume that they are allowed to produce. And so when you start talking about, well, what other sources out there, there's been visits to Maduro in Venezuela, discussion about the JCPOA and what that can do to Iran. In some instances, seepage, what we call seepage, away from sanctions. If China continues to buy or India continues to buy Russian oil or even Iranian oil, that should reduce the pressure on prices, because then other people can look for oil from different sources. But again, this reordering of where these tankers go and how contracts work out takes a while. And then I think, the biggest problem now, by the end of the quarter, we're probably going to have a minor surplus of crude, but it looks like we're still going to have a shortage of adequate refining capacity. And the average consumer doesn't use crude oil, they use products derived from crude oil. So it's going to be interesting to see how that works out. And before we started this, we were talking about in the United States, we're just entering hurricane season. And almost 50% of our refining is in the Gulf of Mexico. So there's plenty of chances. And I was reading this morning that President Biden is considering issuing an emergency order to urge refiners to increase throughput. And they're already at about 95% utilization. And having worked in a refinery, when you start running it hot and heavy for a long period of time, generally bad things happen. So you don't want, on a consistent basis, to be running at 97%, right? So it's going to be touch and go here. I think the expectation, the best solution here is that the global economy slows down a bit. Not a recession necessarily, but slows down a bit. There is finally an elastic price impact where consumers decide to cut back. Various countries put in efficiency measures or fuel switching measures. And I think Hussein is absolutely right. In Europe, you may see this summer industry that relies on natural gas throttle back a bit. So this is not without pain. But there's got to be, and this is where the policy comes in, I think the US and the Western countries are intent on punishing Russia for this invasion of Ukraine. Not only for the barbaric way it was carried out, but also to send a message for other potentially aggressor nations in the future that you just can't be big and push people around. This has exposed a lot of things, and we can get into this later on the policy side, but you know, the UN was supposed to prevent things like this from happening, but when you have the 5 largest countries with a veto on the National Security Council, you can't get a resolution that condemns this type of invasion. We did get that kind of a resolution on the JCPOA for Iran, for example. So it's a very difficult diplomatic as well as economic play that we're looking at.
Frank, sorry, go ahead, Hussein.
I agree completely with everything Frank said, but I'd like to add a couple of points. On the refining side, the profit margin that the refiners had for years was close to, say, $10 a barrel. Now it's 6 times as much and rising. That really shows how tight that market is, how difficult it is to expand it. And there's been lack of maintenance. There's been basically, since the Arab oil embargo, there hasn't been a new large refinery built in the US. So these are serious problems. In Europe, the price elasticity is really not going to work that well in Western Europe, because they have been very active in reducing waste considerably. So although it's going to help in the rest of the world, it's really in Western Europe, it's going to be a problem. They don't have that much waste. So because of their high efficiency, they're going to pay the price now with all these limitations that they have. And particularly in the gas, as Frank said, it's going to hit that industrial base.
Is there a way that we can increase or enhance U.S. crude production, either offshore or onshore? And furthermore, is there any debottlenecking that we can do in the refineries or pipeline systems? What can we do in the U.S. to increase our production of crude and refined?
So I may be a bit of an outlier here with some of my industry friends. The constraints, when we looked at it for the Biden folks in 2019, 4% of US production onshore was on federal lands. There's a lot on state and private land. The notion that you could reduce production from federal lands, I don't think we fully anticipated that the agenda would be taken over to impact the offshore, because the offshore was producing 2 million barrels a day. That's more than a lot of countries, right? So that's a concern. The tight oil production, what's called the shale production, is actually rising again. So some of the easy stuff's been done in the industry. You can drill a well but not complete it. And so you incur the costs when you drill the well, but then you kind of cap it and you wait until prices go up. And then you put field crews back in, and you can produce rather quickly. At one point, we had 4,500 drilled but uncompleted wells. We call them DUCs. And those, most of them, the profitable ones, have already come back on. So to bring on additional production is going to be more costly, require more rigs, more people, and the rig count's going up, but going up slowly, and pipelines to be able to transport it. And again, going back to the earlier comments, the tight oil is generally light oil. Our Gulf Coast refineries require medium to heavy oil. So that's an exportable barrel that could go somewhere. But when you talk about policy, there's recommendations in Congress to ban US exports, which would be insanely stupid because we couldn't use any more light oil in this country. It wouldn't do anything for gasoline prices. that's set kind of on an international market, and it would deprive other people of the ability to use the light oil and replace something else. Again, on the replacement, and we talked about this a little bit, but Saudi Arabia. So in the summertime, the Saudis, and it's lower than it used to be, but they use crude oil to burn for electricity generation. So to the extent that they have spare capacity that they're willing to use, now is the worst time for them to be able to send more oil to the international market when they need it at home. So I don't expect a lot of relief. I mean, the president is supposed to visit Saudi Arabia in July, but it'll be interesting to see just what comes out of that. And that's why I think a lot of folks are scouring the world to see whether the producers of oil and gas, and the Europeans are doing the same thing. The commission is going around to Algeria, Canada, Libya, to see what oil supplies, Qatar, and what gas supplies might be available outside of Russia. But it takes time to get these contracts and logistics put in place.
Let me very quickly add something on the shale side. The shale story is really been a sweet and sour dish. It helped us a great deal to raise the level of production, but it actually killed the exploration efforts in the Arctic, and also reduced the exploration efforts offshore in the Gulf of Mexico. So that was definitely the downside of the shale activity. But on the gas side, in Europe in particular, there seems to be some alternatives. LNG, for example. It's usually a good idea to use LNG, and it's been on the rise. But there are a number of countries that have been very active in that regard. Qatar, because they really didn't have much choice. They didn't have a local market. They didn't have a regional market. So from the beginning, they decided that the only way out for them to market that gas was the liquefaction route and the LNG. And they've been very successful. Europeans helped them a great deal, but then the American companies woke up to it, and they started participating in the activities, and they've been very successful as well. Australia is another country, and in fact, they go neck and neck with Qatar on the export side. But they're exporting 80% of their total production. So in fact, right now, there is a shortage of gas. And I'm really not sure how successful they can be in exporting more LNG. The other factor, of course, is the limitation on the receiving end. There are only a few terminals that can receive LNG. So that is not really good news. Then, of course, U.S. has plenty of gas that can convert and ship, but it's going to take time. But the problem with the U.S. gas is that majority of it is associated with the shale and fracking, and their concern and their limitations there is not to utilize that sort of thing. So maybe under emergency, they would waive that, but that's another concern as well. But coal was easy to get rid of, and basically use alternative sources. Oil is a fungible commodity. The world has a long experience with the shipment of oil. But gas is more limited. It's either by pipeline or LNG, and most of the pipeline is within the areas of Eastern Europe, mostly either part of former Soviet Union or in their area of influence. So it's definitely the most difficult part.
Is LNG an option to make Europe a little bit less vulnerable to Russian gas? I noticed that we're exporting a lot of LNG, but a pipeline that went into one of our LNG operation burst, and that whole operation got delayed until late September, maybe next year. And the net result was US gas prices went down by 18%, while European gas prices went up by 21 and then 11%. So the system is very, very tight. Are there any other LNG operations that might be able to step in?
Two initial thoughts, right? So the Europeans, in addition to scouring the world for LNG suppliers, which they've started to do, and they're making visits from country to country, they've also contracted for at least 2 floating LNG facilities, which are used in the Gulf, the Arabian Gulf, all the time for electricity generation. And these are regas units. They bring LNG in, they regasify offshore, and then they bring electricity onshore. I think there will be conservation measures and alternative fuel measures that you'll see put in place this summer in Europe. The EU Commission said that their storage rate for Europe as a whole is between 40 and 50% at this time of year. They'd like it to be 85 or 90% by the time October rolls around. So we'll see how close they can get to that. Otherwise, it gets more severe as you get closer to winter. And, God help us if we have a cold spell early, on what those price impacts look like. From the United States, the Freeport accident, initially the company thought it would take a couple of weeks to get back on track. It looks now like some of the repairs can be made, and it can be partially back by the end of September, but fully back by the end of the year. So we're still waiting to see what the volumetric impact's going to be. And that's a good news, bad news story too, because what that means is for the United States, this volume that used to go to 80% of that gas goes abroad is LNG. The gas that comes out of the fields, Fayetteville and Haynesville, that feeds Freeport, will go into US storage because it doesn't have a home. And that's why domestic prices are right now depressed. But in addition to Hussein's point about we have a lot of fields where associated gas comes out with the oil, but we also have gas well gas. So the Fayetteville, the Haynesville, the Marcellus are primarily gas fields. And so then it's going to be an infrastructure problem on how you get that to port and how you get that out. And then on the European side, what are the receiving terminals? Like Spain has additional capacity to receive LNG, but they're not really well connected to the rest of Europe. So there's logistical pieces that have to be put in place to be able to make this work. And the other thing is, I do think that people are minimizing this. This is not a 6-month deal. This for me goes next year. I mean, depending on how long and how severe the Russian incursion lasts, right? But it doesn't look like it's going away anytime soon. And demand and a recession can always reduce consumption. But short of that, this carries over to 2023. So it's not just a solution of we got to get by this winter and it's done deal, because you can't build this stuff. And we don't see big new gas additions coming on till 2024, 2025. So this is why the push for environmentalists will use this to accelerate the transition to renewables. And there's benefits to that. There's also severe challenges to that we can talk about.
Hussein, go ahead.
Yeah, and another problem I see is that the European needs is immediate and short term. And gas is a whole different ballgame. It usually requires long-term commitments. And there are also other restrictions. For example, Qatar started talking to Germany and promised them assistance in shipping more LNG to Germany. But later on, they said, well, we're going to index the price to oil, which they did not accept. So there are additional problems there as well. that is going to haunt Europeans on this gas, access to gas that they need.
We are dependent on fossil fuels for 85% of our energy mix. Hydro and nuclear accounts for about 11%, and wind and solar only 4%. So what is even if we double and triple alternative sources of energy, we have to deal with this geopolitical issue that seems to be lingering on. What options do we have in terms of dealing with global warming at the same time while we address the constraints that are already in place in our energy sectors?
Absolutely. And this is where, kind of the rubber meets the road on a lot of conflicting issues. So there's the geopolitics versus the economics. Is the short-term solution to punish Russia, legitimately, or to minimize the price impact so we don't have a recession? And I would argue that at least at this point, both Europe and the United States are convinced that the right thing to do is to punish Russia. Now, there's I think a longer term issue down the road is that what does a post-Putin Russia looks like? And I'm just using that as an example, but if you're talking about energy security or stability in Europe, I don't think you want a country the size of Russia with nuclear weapons to be a failed state, right? That doesn't help anyone, but we haven't at least articulated the plan for when this is over, because the immediate concern, as Hussein said, is to focus right on Russia right now and punish them. There's also the climate energy conundrum that the Europeans are facing. And with respect to gas, you can see it in 2 or 3 ways. So there's alternatives that you can bring on, and they ought to accelerate that as much as they can. And the same with conservation. And there will be forced cutbacks because there will be pain with this. But the rest of the world also uses gas as well. So if the supply to China, for example, gets turned off, or India, they'll use coal, which can't help the environmental consequences. And for the Europeans, because they're convinced that they need to decarbonize quickly, they're looking for gas, but they don't want to sign long-term contracts. And in this tight market, trying to just buy spot gas is going to be very difficult and very expensive. So I think when the commission does its tour around the world and says, will you commit to give us supply? People are going to say, yeah, but we want to know that you're going to take it for a long time to justify our investment. Now, there's ways to do that. You can allow people to write off investments faster. But this notion that we're going to be off oil by, I think, in personal view, by 2030 is just, it's a pipe dream. So we ought to just be aware of the fact that we're going to be living with oil and gas because it makes up 65% of the global consumption for at least the next 20 years. We ought to decarbonize. We ought to take care of the methane issue as fast as possible, because those are things that we can do. But you need to make sure and increase the role of nuclear, that you have a plan for sustainable, affordable, and reliable energy for countries going forward.
One of the questions from our participants, what do you anticipate gasoline prices to be in the near future?
So I think it's going to be high through the summer. If you look at the forward curve on crude, if there's a slowdown in economic activity, crude will come down and gasoline will come down after that, barring any hurricane that, takes refining out. We talk about gasoline prices always shoot up like a rocket and come down like a feather. And that's because the gasoline stations, most of them are small business operations. They're not owned by Exxon, they're owned by independents. And they charge the gasoline price not based on what the cost of the crude was that's in their pumps. It's on the next delivery that they have to pay for gasoline, because it's cash and carry, right? So if they anticipate that the next truckload is going to cost them X, then they adjust the price. And it's not reflective of what they bought before. And that where they make their money is on the way down. they slowly
Right, right.
reduce prices. If oil were to go to like $150, you would see $6 gasoline. Then I think demand destruction kicks in if it doesn't kick in sooner than that. I think there's a way to cut that off so we don't get that high.
Mhm.
The SPR oil is just starting to flow into the market. We'll see how the economies come back. We'll see what Russia does in terms of the volumes that they lose and who picks it up. Because if other countries pick up some of that supply, it's not lost. It's just a logistical problem of replacing something else, more costly, longer time. But we can live without 2 or 3 million barrels of Russia. We can't live without 7 million barrels a day of Russian oil.
I think short term is going to be difficult. Medium term, it's definitely possible to have lower gas prices because there is plenty of natural gas available, and the US can easily use that technology, the compressed natural gas, as a fuel, at least in for fleets, trucks, and stuff like that. Is going to take a huge load off of the gasoline, and it can be done. The prices, I think, are sufficiently low enough to create that incentive. So far, the industry has been reluctant to do that because they wanted to utilize the refining capacity as much as possible. But now that they don't want to invest, and they're almost up to close to 100% utilization, then maybe they would at least don't lobby against that idea. Gas is definitely should have a premium because of its environmental benefits and so on. But for the last decade or so, if you look at the calorific value, the price of gas was maybe a third or a fourth of what the price of oil was. So this has been modified a little bit over the last few months, but there is room to actually use natural gas in transportation.
Okay, so if I hear you correctly, Hossein, you're saying that oil prices and gasoline prices are going to remain high for a while, might even go up a little bit, but eventually will stabilize and start going down, which is a positive for our economy. However, that still brings up the issue of how do we balance the long-term global warming concerns with the short and medium-term reliance on hydrocarbons. You mentioned we need to shift out of coal, which is the dirtiest one, and gradually shift into natural gas. But that transition is going to be quite difficult. So how do you envision the public policy implications of it and the political issues involved that the society needs to respond to global warming, at the same time handle energy requirements of our economy?
I think there's no easy fix, but I think conservation would be the key. It's the quickest possible way. It's the cheapest possible way. And it would certainly be the best way to help the environment. It's not it has a negative connotation, at least in the West, because of their technological capabilities and so on. But these are tough times, and emergency measures have to be used. And I think conservation would be the one.
Talking to my children and my students, they keep on telling me that conservation and cutting back on our energy hydrocarbon energy requirements and need is the best way to address global warming. And while the short-term implications of energy is complicated, in the long term, we need to address that. In conclusion, our discussion should have us very concerned about European dependence on Russian natural gas exports. If or when Russia limits or restricts its gas exports to Europe, European gas prices will likely rise rapidly, shortages will occur, and European industry and consumers will suffer. This would not be a good sign for the West. Also, sanctions on Russian oil exports has caused a difficult redistribution of available crude in the global supply chain. Matching difficult crude types to refineries that have already producing at peak capacity will continue to put pressure on gasoline prices until the system can be recalibrated. Frank, I'll leave you to give our final thoughts. Thank you.
Let me start with governance. I think the biggest concern I have is that we see a world devolving into a kind of liberal democracies against autocratic rulers, right? And if we get away from globalization, we've kind of trashed just-in-time inventory. Not every country can be self-sufficient in all materials that they need. Maybe the rich countries can do that, but certainly the poor countries can't. And when you look at some of the minerals and materials that you need for renewables, China is locking up some of that, and mining has emissions costs too. So we have to take a more holistic view. I do think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. I hope that's the case. And the notion that this current situation, as awful as it is, as horrible as it is, should not prevent us from continuing to move on to the transition, because we need to do that. If you look at the IPCC reports, there's no question that the longer we delay taking action on climate, the more costly and more devastating it's going to be. So we need to do that. And so like methane capture is one way that the oil industry can help. But in the immediate focus, governments are elected to do what the people need. And there's a security aspect, the trade and foreign policy aspect, an environmental aspect, an economic aspect, an energy security aspect, and there's trade-offs all the way down the line. And if people are not satisfied with what the current governments look like, and they elect a new crop, there's a lot of rhetoric out there of if I was in office, I'd correct this tomorrow. Well, you can't correct this tomorrow. And we would just be the same range of solutions with new people starting later. So I worry about that. But I do think there needs to be some strategic thinking about how we approach this, while recognizing that you have to deal with the current situation in front of you. Otherwise, you won't be in office that long.
Gentlemen, we've run out of time. I want to thank both of you for a wonderful webinar, Frank and Hussein. It was a pleasure being with you. Thank you so much.